Hello, everyone. My name is Rafal, and I'd like to welcome everyone to my Headshot Photography podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Kersten Lust. Lutz. That's good. It's in the house. I just want to say, well, first of all, thank you for accepting my invitation. We've been knowing each other for quite some time. You invited me to your amazing podcast. I was quite shocked when you invited me because your guests are, top notch, one of the top photographers in the industry. So I'm like, why he wants to talk to me? But you invited me. I am very thankful and appreciated, and I think we had fantastic conversation. So I just want to welcome you back to my actually podcast because you do a lot of interesting things. You're a photographer, you're a musician, you're a podcaster. It seems like you're doing everything and you're doing this also very, very well. So I'm going to pick up your brain today and I'm going to try to kind of dive into your world. And as I mentioned right before we started, that I was trying to kind of figure out, like, how I'm going to approach this conversation because there's tons of stuff we can talk about it. But as I said, I just want to start. How did you get into this photography world? Like, what is your story, and how did you start the podcast? Because I think, like in my case, it was kind of accident a little bit. I tried to do something different just to kind of take my mind off, what's happening into my photography world, and just kind of talk more to photographers because I've noticed every conversation I had brings something new to the table, something that inspires me, something that I didn't know before, and hearing kind of perspectives from professionals and people who are successful is extremely valuable. And I think, just as I said, it just brings something new to what do we do. So tell me a little bit your story. How did you get in this whole thing? What was your path? And also, I want to know a little bit more. How did you get into podcasting? Because that's actually, I'm very interested. How did you get into this whole thing?
Well, first of all, Rafael, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm actually generally honored to be on your show, and I'll tell you why. Because I've been listening to your channel, really I mean, ever since before I started my podcast in the first place. It's I'm truly honored to be on your show, and yes, I've had you on my show twice because
Yes.
we've had the first time we had such a great conversation, and I thought it'd be amazing to have you back on the show. And this is kind of what I like to do on my podcast is really create like a community of people. So I actually really like it when people return and come back on the show because it means, first of all, it means I didn't scare them off, which is great. But in terms of my story, so in terms of photography, I used to be a session musician
Hmm.
in London, England, where I live, and I used to be a session musician here for over 20 years. Um, so I used to play on recordings, I used to do live shows. My thing was more recordings. So I used to work in studios a lot. Um, and at some point, I set up a music school and I ran that for 12 years. And in 2013, 2013, my life took a left-hand turn.
Hmm.
And due to circumstances, and my dad died and my grandmother died and my granddad died in like 12 months, and my relationship split up, and all. It's one of these, what do they call it, annus horribilis, where it's like this year where everything goes wrong, everything seems to go wrong. And I decided that I needed to you know make a career change, really. And I just need to change my life. I need to change things. And I went back to Germany, where my mom lived at the time.
Hmm.
And, um, you know, and I basically said to her, well, I've really come to the end, of this road. I really need to think of something else. And she said to me, I think you should get yourself a camera because that worked for your dad, who was a photographer, and it also worked for your grandmother, who was also a photographer.
Oh.
Um, and I thought, well, that sounds like a pretty good idea. So that's what I did. I went to a camera store. I bought a camera. Actually, my mom bought a camera for me.
Mhm.
And and I opened the box, and the family curse, the Lutz family curse, took hold of me. I mean, I opened the thing, I took the camera out, and I knew I was going to get totally addicted to it. And I've loved every second of it. Um, and the first thing I did was I simply started photographing my friends who
Mm.
were musicians, and I literally stepped off the stage and I photographed what was going on stage. Um, for the first year or so. And if anybody told me that you can take photographs at f8, I would have called them a liar, because in my world, photographing bands, you shot wide open and that was it. Like,
Mm.
if I stopped down to
Yes.
4.5, there was nothing there. So and then yeah, and then um I ended up getting into commercial photography.
Mm.
um and then I started really focusing on conferences. So I specialized in shooting conferences, predominantly for international corporates.
Okay.
So so my job was basically to they would hire me to uh, they would fly me out to some conference somewhere, and I would be there for 3 or 4 days with the duration of the conference. And I would shoot the whole thing, all the um, the breakout sessions, speeches, awards, black tie dinners, social events, whatever was going on, headshots, of course, at
Mhm.
conferences. And that was great because it was, first of all, it's good money, and secondly, once you have a corporate client, especially an international corporate, they run several conferences a year. So if you don't really need that many clients in order to keep you busy,
Yeah.
because if every client does a number of conferences around the world, you don't really need that many to actually make a difference. So that kind of worked for me until
Mm.
the pandemic hit.
Mhm.
And when the pandemic hit, and I remember, I was in fact I was at a conference in Budapest, in Hungary. um, and I typically I'd work very closely with the AV team, so the guys that run the sound and the video and all the displays and the screens and
Mhm.
everything. Because there's always a lot of back and forth. Like, I would create imagery, and they would need imagery of the previous day to put into presentations for the following day. So you work with these guys, and so what happens is you work with those teams repeatedly. You meet, either you're actually, if you're working with the same client, they always hire the same company, so you know these guys. And then occasionally you run into people at a conference. You go like, "Hey, how are you doing?" Because we worked together a few months ago in some other place.
Mhm.
Um, and I remember, we were sitting at a restaurant and we're having dinner, and on the TV screens, these scenes in Italy were playing out.
Mhm.
The pandemic had happened and it was terrible, and it hadn't really reached the UK yet.
Mhm.
But the scenes in Italy were terrifying, and I remember saying to a friend of mine, I don't think we're going to be working together for the foreseeable
Mhm.
future. And I
Wow.
literally, I got a plane back to the UK, and literally within a week or so, the virus was detected over here, and then all hell broke loose, and the rest is history, really. You
Yeah.
know,
It happened really quickly. I remember the same thing. It
yeah,
was just like everything was just happening at the front of our eyes, and the governments everywhere, they're just like shutting things. Like, I remember in Canada when it would happen within weeks, like from normal life to
yeah,
like literally you have to stay at home and just don't leave your place. Just, yeah, I remember that time. It was horrifying. Yeah.
yeah. It was terrible, and over here in the UK, we had really severe lockdowns. It
Mhm.
was really
Yeah.
very draconian. The first, I mean, the first lockdown was nuts. Basically, we were allowed to leave our house for 45 minutes a day for exercise,
Mhm.
and that was it. Other than that, you were basically refined to your house. Um, and for the first couple of weeks, it was okay. Well,
Yeah.
I guess we're taking a break. Um, but of course, nobody knew how long this was going to last. Little did anybody know at that point that this was going to go on for months and months and months. In fact, it went on really for 2 years. You know,
Yeah.
um, and I remember at the end of, I think it was the end of March, 2020. There was a day where my phone basically rang off the hook, and every call I took was a cancellation. So it was like, okay, well, this conference, we have to cancel it. That conference, we have to cancel it. And then some clients at that point were trying to rearrange dates for later on in the year, because there's two conference seasons. There's the spring and then there's the fall. And so at that early stage, some clients were still thinking, well, maybe if we can move it to October, we'll be fine. Of course, that didn't work out. And so really, by the end of the day, I was looking at my diary and it was basically empty. And I thought, oh, that's not looking good.
Yeah.
So, I watched a lot of Netflix, and I did the Marvel movie marathon a couple of times.
Mhm.
Um,
We all did.
yeah, exactly. And it's family Zoom quizzes and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And after a few weeks, I really got bored. It was really starting to really have an effect. And I realized I need to do something creative. I need to do something, because there's this thing when there was a point where I remember waking up in the morning not knowing what day it was.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. We're completely out of living in a completely different reality. That's how I felt it.
exactly. You wake up, and I remember asking my wife, "What day is it?" She goes, "Okay, I think it's Tuesday."
Yeah.
But it could be
So
Wednesday.
let's check it.
Yeah. And and then a week after that, you get to the point where you wake up in the morning, you don't know what day it is, and you don't care anymore.
Yeah.
And at that point, I knew things had to change. I had to do something that would kind of create structure.
Mhm.
You know, um, and so at that time, pretty much every day I was talking on the phone or on FaceTime with a friend of mine who's a filmmaker or videographer. And we were just chatting every day. We were chatting, we would talk camera nerdy stuff.
Mhm.
And then I remember it was a Friday afternoon, and I remember saying to him, like, I could do something. I could do something creative, something different. And I said, do you remember this idea that we had like 6 months ago about making a podcast?
Mhm.
And under normal circumstances, you sometimes you have a good idea and you kick the can down the road because life gets in the way.
Mhm.
Kids, work, family life, all that kind of stuff, normal life basically. And you think you have a really good idea, but then nothing happens for 3 months, nothing happens for 6 months, and eventually maybe you forget about it. you
Mhm.
know but this just seemed to be the right moment, and so I said, how about we do that? And then we started discussing it. How do you do a podcast? Like, how does this work? How do you record it? What should we call it? How long should it be? What should we talk about? um
Mhm.
where do podcasts live? How do you get your recording onto Apple Podcasts? Like, how does any of this work,
Mhm.
right? um and the thing, as we were talking about it, the thing is, like, sometimes you talk about stuff like that and you get more into the weeds of it, and then you come up against problems and obstacles. And
Mhm.
what happens very often is you talk yourself out of a good idea. Like, you get to the point where, oh, and how does this work? And how do we do that? And, and by the end of it, you go, you know what, this is just too hard. It's just too difficult. Let's just think of something else. But, and so I kind of realized that the conversation was going that way. And so I said to my friend Nick, I said, well, what are you doing on Monday at, I don't know, 4 p.m.? And, he said, well, nothing, because it's lockdown. He lived in an apartment, so it's even worse for him, really. At least I live in a house and I have a backyard. Um, but he was single, and I have my wife and my kids. And he was single. He was in an apartment and literally locked in an apartment. And
Wow.
so in many ways, it was even worse for him. And he said, "Well, I'm not doing anything on Monday at 4 p.m. because it's lockdown. I can't go anywhere. I'm not doing anything." So I said, "Cool," because Monday 4 p.m. is when we're going to hit record for the first episode. And we're just going to have to figure it out between now and then. We just have to make it happen. That's it. And so we called the first episode "Done is Better Than Perfect"
Mhm.
because we realized we just had to get it done, and it wasn't going to be perfect. because this is the thing, perfection is often the killer of creativity, because you're just you just never you just never get to the point where you actually do the thing. You're just always trying to figure out how to do this better and how to do that better. And we just
Yeah.
thought, we'll figure some stuff out. We'll record an episode, and then if we keep doing this, by the time we get to episode 10, we would have learned a couple of things. And the logic was, episode 10 would be better than episode 1. And then if we made it to episode 20, that would be better than episode 10. And so we would basically learn on the job, and if we made it to episode 50 or something, then we would have learned a good few things, and hopefully, we'd be able to figure stuff out. And that really was the thing. And so, we just had to get started. And then, what happened was we decided that we would record on a Monday. And I'll tell you a funny side story to this, actually, because it was lockdown, so it was difficult. We had to do it via this newfangled thing called Zoom, right?
Yeah.
Um, and but we would record on a Monday, and then we would release the episode on a Thursday, and so it immediately created a structure for the week, because Monday, you're recording, then Tuesday, Wednesday, you have to edit the thing, and then Thursday has to go out, and then Friday, Saturday, you're going to promote it on social media or whatever, and then you're going to have to start thinking about the next episode already. It's what are you going to talk about in that episode? So it really just goes through this typical cycle of pre-production, production, post-production, marketing, back into pre-production. And so it's this, you create this loop. And that really made a huge difference for the months to come, And of course, if anybody told me back then that, I'd still be doing this 270 odd,
Wow.
weeks later, I would have probably called them crazy. But it's just, it's just been so much fun. And actually, just this little side story there. So in the very beginning, it was, we had cameras, so we thought like, okay, we'll film ourselves, but we had to get the files to each other somehow. And so in those days, it wasn't really as easy as just uploading it or something. These video files were huge. So I would literally go around Nick's house and with an SD card, and put the SD card on the roof of his car, and then text him and say, "Hey, it's there." I would get in my car and drive off, and he would come down. It's like like a, what do they call it?
Conspiracy, like
Yeah, like a spy novel thing.
yeah.
Dead drops. That's it. Yeah, it was like a dead
Yeah.
drop.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ryan.
That's perfect. So yeah, you know what? I 100% agree with you. Like I remember, and I don't want to go to my story, but yeah, I had the same thing. Like, I need some structure, and I think yeah, you just don't know where to start. Like I remember I was just recording off, like I had this like weird mics putting close to the mic. It was just disaster. Like I remember my first few episodes. Yeah, it was something that you just like, okay, how I'm gonna even kind of push it through. But as you said, like time and doing things over and over again, you improving, you learning, you figure it out, you try to find solutions. I know nowadays we're living in the kind of times where everything become much more easier, right? Like we have programs which recorded, we can kind of connect it, everything is kind of the back end is really looked after. So I think doing a podcast nowadays is much, much, much easier. Well, it is and it's not. Like you still have to put the effort. It's not something that is going to happen on its own. But I agree with you. The learning process definitely kind of brings something new to the table. And yeah, so let's kind of move forward a little bit, because the people you interviewed over the last months or years, the roster is amazing. Like I just kind of look from of those people, and I watch your podcast and listen to it, because some of those guests are just pretty much, like as I said, like one of the best photographers in the world. So is there any conversation that would really kind of become very memorable for you? Like, you kind of talk to someone who really make huge impact on you and, on your photography and the kind of even seeing the photography world. Which from those guests, you don't have to mention the names, but which of those guests really impacted you throughout inviting them and having them on the podcast and talking to them?
They're really, I mean, there's so many, it's,
Yeah.
there's so, yeah, I would honestly say that there's something in every conversation that does something for me. Either I learn something, because this is like
Mhm.
the thing is, I've learned so much over the last 4 or 5 years,
Mhm.
by talking to people who are really at the cutting edge of what they do,
Mhm.
regardless of, take any genre of photography. That I've learned something with every conversation. So I normally I call it my own personal university, because the really
Mhm.
cool thing is that people give me a few hours of their time, and I can ask them just about anything I want to ask them. In many ways, that's better than a university course. For me, it's you know there's so
Mhm.
many interesting aspects to what people do, and this is across the practical side of photography to the business side of photography, marketing, blah 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 blah, setting up a business, yada yada yada, whatever it is. There's always something interesting. There've been so many different instances where, I could pick things out that really made a difference to me in the way that I view photography, in the way that,
Mhm.
in terms of mindset, technically how I approach certain types of photography, for example. And of course, on the business side as well, the way I run my business, maybe the way I've pivoted, and the way I just run my photography business. The thing for me has been, you know, I can I can pick out a couple of conversations that really stuck with me. One was when I was interviewing Pete Sousa, who used to be Barack
Yes.
Obama's White House photographer. He also worked with Ronald Reagan, actually, during the Reagan administration. But there's a famous picture of Barack Obama during the um, Bin Laden raid. So
Mhm.
do you remember when this team um, of special forces soldiers
Mhm.
raided Osama bin Laden's house, essentially? And there's a famous picture of Barack Obama sitting I think it was in the White House, surrounded by his generals, and they're watching all of this unfold on screens as it was
Yeah, I know the
happening.
shot. Yeah.
Yeah, so Pete Sousa took that shot. So it was really interesting for me to find out what that was like.
Mhm.
Just being able to be a fly on the wall, like what was happening in that room at that moment when that was going down. You could see the tension on these people's faces. But Pete was there. He was in the room. He took that shot. He would have been a witness to really, a historical event. And that's just an interesting thing for me to find out. Like, what was that like? Like, what was the atmosphere like in that room? What was really happening? Like, you know, um, so the instant, and sometimes there are situations that the thing about photography is that photographers get themselves into some really interesting situations sometimes. And I
Mhm.
remember talking to a war photographer. Um, one of the famous shots, Stefano, can't remember the surname. Anyway, um, one of his famous shots was this a civilian who got shot by a sniper in Iraq.
Mhm.
And Stefano was embedded with the U.S. Army in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the civilian had been shot, and he was lying on the road. And when you're there as a photographer, you've got a choice to make. You can either help this guy and potentially save his life,
Mhm.
or you can take the shot and tell the world what's happening.
Mhm.
What do you do? And these are really interesting moments, because it's how do you make that decision? You have to live with that decision for the rest of your life. What if you take the shot and the guy dies? That's on
Mhm.
your conscience somehow. Um, what if you don't take the shot and don't tell the world what's really happening behind the scenes? Then maybe this conflict might go on for even longer.
Mhm.
These are decisions that I don't know how I would react in a situation like that. Um, and I just find it very interesting to explore those sort of situations and those moments. You know,
Mhm.
and then on the flip side, I've had a lot of motivational conversations, with people who just basically tell you the truth. And
Mhm.
I remember a conversation with Joel Grimes. He told me about how he built his business in the very beginning because he focused on marketing, relentlessly.
Mhm.
Um, and it was just such a cool story where it really made me think about how I approach my photography business and what I actually do in terms of marketing and how consistent I really am. And all of these conversations are, for me, they're super interesting. My hope is that they're also interesting for the audience. And they've really changed the way I approach things
Mhm.
dramatically.
Yeah. So is there any common thing, and I'm asking you because like I kind of, this is my experience, any kind of common thing you see or hear or kind of experience by talking to all these people when it comes to photography? Because one of the things what I've noticed, and which really impacted me and kind of like changed the way I think about photography, because I think we all started with equipment and then lighting and all these technicalities, but those guys who really reach, as you said, the cutting edge of being photographer, and they're reaching the highest level in their profession, those are the people who like really pass this, right? The people who really kind of look at, it's not from the technical perspective, as you said, like the situations, like you are in those kind of circumstances where you have to make a decision, and then you have to make a choice, like what I should do. um and those are, I think, those moments which really um kind of like has the photography is just a kind of, maybe not say a tool, but the kind of extension who we are sometimes, right? So have you seen, or what is your experience talking to all these amazing photographers, if there is some kind of pattern they approach photography, or there's some kind of things which kind of stand out through talking to them? I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah,
uh, yeah, I kind of, from my conversations, I have seen that there's this kind of common thing sometimes where, I'm not saying they're repeating itself, but yeah, there's this kind of like, I don't know, part of their personalities that kind of go beyond what kind of like their average person is doing.
I think it's consistency. In one word, it's really consistency. And I think people don't really. I think a lot of the time people don't appreciate what that really means. It really means um, you know doing the thing regardless of what the response is, for example, or what the immediate result is, and sort of taking a long view, because almost everything in life is a marathon and not a sprint. There are always exceptions. There are people that become successful overnight because of some fluke something. But the reality is that for the vast, 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 vast majority of people, um, you know, success. First of all, I mean, success can mean different things,
Hmm.
but it's often it's sort of it's something where you have to apply yourself for a number of years, before anything even happens. Photography is one of those things. The thing about photography is, and you mentioned it, people are, especially in the beginning, are very much focused on the technical side, the gear, because it's kind of cool, camera bodies and lenses and software and stuff. It's attractive to people who are technologically minded in a sense, and you have this. On one hand, you have photographers coming into photography through that route, the gear side of things.
Hmm.
The other side would be the creative part of it. But either way, you're going to have to learn how to use the gear, so that'll take some time. You know,
Hmm.
one. I mean, but there is a thing where, and let's talk headshots for a minute. Since we're both headshot photographers,
Hmm.
ultimately, you know, I always say to people, like when I talk at like camera clubs and something, you know, being able to take a great headshot, being able to take a really good photo and light it and stuff, and make it look good, it's sort of base level. This is like, if you're a professional headshot photographer, this is the basic expectation. You know,
Hmm.
you should be able to do the job. Just like if you're a carpenter and you're hired to, I don't know, make a roof for a house, the client has that basic expectation that you know how to do that.
Hmm.
You know, so it's like the fact that you can take headshots and light them well or whatever, there's nothing special. It's just
Hmm.
that's the
Ba-
basic
Bare
expectation.
minimum, yeah.
Yeah, it's the bare minimum. Exactly. That is the thing. um so then the next thing is then, well, okay, so what's important is repetition. It's really just
Hmm.
consistency, being consistent in the way that you approach things. you know maybe if you want to create your own style, your own look, it takes time, and it means being consistent over time. And the same thing when you start a podcast or a YouTube channel or
Mm.
whatever it may be. Um, and what happens is over time, you get really good at doing that thing. It's like learning an instrument.
Yeah.
If you learn the guitar, the first time you pick up a guitar, it's going to sound pretty terrible, you know. But if you put in the whatever 10,000 hours, you
Yeah.
know,
There's no
you
way you can.
yeah, you'll eventually get good at it,
Totally.
and there's no way you cannot get good at it. It's just
Yeah.
one of these things. So consistency is absolutely the key
Yeah.
to any
I
good.
100% agree with you, but I would like to add like one little thing.
Mhm.
I think we're living also in this kind of very fast-paced world, right? Where everything is changing quickly. We want to be successful quickly. We want to get this rewards right away.
Yeah.
But well, I think photography, like any other profession, right? As you said, it takes time and practice and putting tons of hours into it. I always say that talent has nothing to do with photography. Like you might have a little bit of talent, but you have to just still practice. Just having talent doesn't do anything. Um, but also the going back to my original question, I think one of the things what I've noticed through those conversation I had, that these people dedicating their life to it, right? And then you also said that it's not something like, oh, I'm going to do this on the side and I'm going to become this best photographer in the world. Like these people, they live, breathe, and sleep with photography. It's like their entire life just kind of like is evolving around it, right? um and yeah, I agree with what you said, that you have to put hours into this whole work. But tell me, like, from your perspective, because people kind of like when they, let's say, graduating from schools, or they kind of getting into this big world, and they decided to become a photographer, and not a lot of them realize that like if you want to be good at it, like you have to dedicate life into it, right? I know it's hard pill to swallow for some time for some people, because like why do I want to do this for all my life, right? But I think, don't you think like this is the only way to get to the level that you really can achieve some big success into this in this industry?
Well, yes, but the thing is, again, there are different ways that you could measure success, because
Mhm.
success could mean becoming the most popular photographer.
Yeah.
It could also mean just making a living, being
Yeah.
able to feed your family. That's success, on many levels.
Yeah.
Being able to do photography full time. I think there's a lot of people who do it as a um, as a side job sort of a thing, who would love to do it full time.
Yeah.
And that's success.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the beginning, when you're first starting out, you're making that transition maybe you know from uh, hobby photographer to professional. The first time you get paid for a shoot, that's success.
That's
So
success.
success can mean many, many different things.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily have to be like, oh, the, becoming the greatest photographer since sliced bread. But the thing is, it's also a multi-stage type of a thing. Being able, being good at the craft is one thing. Um, Becoming better at, especially if you're a portrait photographer, or you're
Mm.
or even a wedding photographer, you're photographing people, improving your communication skills, that's a thing you have to work on. It doesn't have anything to do with manipulating the camera or taking a picture.
Mhm.
It's really about being able to communicate with people. Then there's the business side of it. Being able to actually run a photography business, which requires business skills that are kind of generic.
Mhm.
The same skills that it takes to run a bakery. These
Mhm.
are the same skills that it takes to run a photography business. And I think this is the thing. Is realizing that, well, first of all, having a goal and figuring, this is what I want to do. Um, because you could say, I want to get really good at sports photography, not because I want to work for the London Times, or whatever
Mhm.
the magazines are, or websites are these days, but because I want to enter sports shots into competitions. This could be a goal, right? Um, you know, there's so many different goals that people could have. But
Yeah.
whatever it is that you want to do, you're gonna have to apply yourself. And again, it's rinse and repeat. You just have to keep doing it. And eventually, whatever your goal is, and I think this idea of goal setting is super important. I think you need to
Mhm.
set yourself a goal and then try and achieve that goal.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. And one kind of example which comes to my mind, I'm sure you very familiar with that story with Vivian Meyer, who
Mhm.
was like this nanny, and she was just like doing all this amazing work. Nobody see it and almost got lost. This like literally accident that this whole thing came out to the world. But apparently she was doing this whole thing her entire life, stucking all these films and then just kind of hiding her work. um and like we talk about being photographer and businessman and all doing all this stuff, but there are example of people who like doing this just for whatever reasons, right? Because like like nobody at this point can talk to her and see like what was behind it. But it's also, it seems like she dedicated her entire life into this whole thing.
Yeah.
And she was hiding this whole thing, the whole life. Like even people who she worked for, right, had no idea what the hell she's doing, except those like kids who were like dragged into this like areas where she shouldn't go, just to take those shots and to photograph people. So yeah, so as you said, like people might have different purposes and different reasons, but it's, I guess, also
Mhm.
interesting how different direction this whole thing might go, right, for different people.
Because I mean, the same thing, can be said for painters. Van Gogh, for example, not very successful during his lifetime, and then after his death, all of a sudden, becomes
Yeah.
one of the most, expensive in a sense,
Iconic. Yeah.
yeah, iconic painters there. Um, but it just, that's just, that shows you one thing. It's people have different people have different reasons as to why they do something. Uh, Selling yourself or selling your work in today's modern world, and this really applies for photography just as it applies for music, for example.
Mm.
Take music as an example. Music is always a great example because if you're playing a band today, yeah, you need to be able to write good songs and create good product. So you need to be able to play your instrument or sing. You need to be really good
Mhm.
at songwriting, but you also need to be really good at marketing. And
Yeah.
that's the thing, because if you just sit in your bedroom and you write songs, and you hope that somebody discovers you one day, it most likely will never happen. So
Yeah.
you have to get into the marketing game and get really good at that, and market yourself out there, put your stuff out there. And the same thing is true for photography. And the standard avenues that we have to start with on the surface of it are things like the internet, social media, and all that kind of stuff. But that's really is only the beginning, because everybody can do that. The question is, what can you do to get your work in front of the right people that
Mhm.
is different from what everybody else does? That's
Yeah.
that's the real question.
That's the real question. And I think for a lot of photographers, this is the biggest challenge, right? Because I agree with you. People want to create, they want to take pictures, they want to, produce, I don't know, art, headshots, portraits. But selling this stuff, it's another beast, right? And I think a lot of
Yeah,
people struggle there, and just, learning those skills from the beginning is extremely important. Like I remember, even from my own experience, those are the skills which I had to like really push it through, because like that's was something I didn't want to focus too much at the beginning. I had to at some point, because like you cannot make a living if you just like doing work for yourself.
yeah.
But yeah, I think that's advice for a lot of photographers out there. If you're planning into getting into this industry, it's not just the photography, it's a complex things you have to learn, and skills, and develop all sorts of different avenues to make it whole thing work. And I think that's another thing, the world we live in, right? It's not like you can create art just for fun. Like if you want to live of this, it takes way more than just creating
And
images.
and it's an intrinsic. It's sort of a thing. For creative people are not really very most of the time. They're not very business minded, and it makes sense, because if you're creative, you just want to make the thing. Whatever art it is. If you're a musician, you want to
Yeah.
make music. If you're a photographer, you want to make photos. If you're a painter, you want to paint, because this is the thing that you like to start with. This is the thing that gets you into that creative art normally. To
Yes.
start with. And really, when you're 14, and you sit in your bedroom and you think like, oh, what do I want to do? I want to do the things that I really love doing. Wouldn't it be great if I could be a professional musician or a professional photographer, and I could do nothing but nothing other than the thing that I'm doing, which is taking pictures or writing or playing music. But that's amazing. What you don't realize at that point is that once you get to the point where you're a professional musician or photographer or whatever,
Mhm.
the taking pictures bit is a very small percentage of your time.
Yes.
The much, much, much larger percentage of your time is actually marketing yourself, saying yourself, talking to clients, promoting your
Yeah.
business, whatever it is. So if that's not a thing that you're into, or if that is so majorly opposed to what you really want to do and what you like doing, if you totally loathe that side of things, then maybe it's better for you to just stay an enthusiast, because then you can just pick up the camera or pick up your guitar and have fun doing that whenever you want. And nothing there's nothing in the world that can basically tell you, oh, you can't light portraits like that because it's not commercially viable, because nobody will buy it. You know,
Mhm.
you can just do whatever you want. That's the thing.
Yeah.
You can just do
Absolutely.
absolutely whatever you want, whenever you want it. And it's actually, that's beautiful in many ways. I remember as a session musician, there were times when I missed that freedom. When I remember, like, as a kid, I don't know, I would wake up and I would like look through my dad's record collection. I would find some record that I'd never seen before. I put it on, and and I remember one day I picked up a Stanley Clarke record. I put it on, and I never heard that kind of music before. And it was like, it
Mhm.
blew my mind. I was like, whoa! And I could hear guitar, but it was different from the guitars that I've heard before. And I thought, wow, I want to learn how to play that. You know,
Mhm.
and so I could spend time
Yeah.
learning that, and then a month later, I'd find a different record or hear a different song on the radio or whatever, and it's back, when radio still existed.
Mhm.
Um, and that would take me into a different direction, and it would, you know, inflame my curiosity, and I could just go and do that, and you had all the freedom in the world to do that.
Yeah.
Fast forward 15 years, it's like, okay, today after this session, I need to do this. I need to prepare these songs. I've got to, I don't know, play this gig. So that's the set list. So I have to work on those. You lose that freedom
Mm.
to really, to be creative at any point, and do all the things that you want to do once you take that step to being a professional, you know, insert creative art form
Mhm.
here, musician, photographer, whatever, because now there are other forces at play that, you know, that force you to do things, because there are only 24 hours in a day,
Yeah.
you know.
I think time is like the I'm not saying the biggest enemy, but like, nowadays that's what I feel like. It's just so overwhelming with all this stuff. What do we have to do? Actually, I have this conversation a couple days ago, and the gentleman told me, like, back in the days I could put ad in the magazine, and clients were keep coming, and like everything was great. Nowadays I have to like do like marketing strategy, social media, like advertising, and it's like so many strings you have to pull to make this whole thing works, that it's absolutely crazy how much time we have to put in it, right? I'm
Yeah,
guessing it might get extremely overwhelming for a lot of people, because as you said, like, photography might become this like very very small portion. What do we do? Rest of it, it's just like pushing your name out there, communicating with clients, finding new clients, and it's just like ongoing thing which you have to just battle every single day. But also, what I want to go back to that freedom which you said, which is also kind of very interesting point, that I think it's important to find this balance, right? That we still have a little bit of kind of this creativity freedom. We can kind of go that direction, because
yeah,
I
big time.
felt many times that like I had those months where it was just strict work. What clients required. There's nothing when it comes to pushing any creativity into my work. And I really start feeling like, okay, I'm burning out right now, right? Like, it's just eating you inside, that you just doing this, like, I don't know, job which just feels like, you're going to factory, right? Like, you're just putting the same kind of things, and then you have to just kind of do this every single day. But being a creative person, I think we need that have at least few C's here and there, so we can kind of like push it through.
Absolutely. I can tell you, I could tell you a little bit about one conversation that really sticks in my mind. I think about this a lot because that has really changed the way I approach things. It's a conversation that I had with Joel Grimes
Okay.
a couple of years ago. And because I remember, thinking, well, Joel is such a phenomenal photographer. His
And he's like
photography.
he's colorblind too, right?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely,
that's
yeah,
another crazy story. Yeah, yeah. That
yeah,
when
yeah,
I heard that story, I'm like, what are you talking about, right?
yeah. I mean, he's unbelievable. But the thing with him is, I used to think, like, how do you get this good? How do you get that good at lighting? How do you create these stunning images that really pop out? Um, this beautiful portraiture and on location portraiture, and it's just you know
It's insane. Yeah.
it's insane. How do you do that? Um, and when I spoke to him, he said to me, the thing that he does is he says every week he works on a personal project, and he's
Mm.
been doing that for 40 years
Wow.
because focusing on personal projects and really making that part of your week or your month, making
Mm.
that part of your life is so important because this is the point when you can really be creative. There's no limits because you're not doing it for a client, you're just doing it for yourself because you want to discover a particular thing, try out things. So finding personal projects and putting some of your energy into that and just doing that every week. And you could quite easily say, like, okay, well, Thursday evenings, Thursdays from 4 till 10, I'm not going to book any clients. I block out my time. I'm not doing anything other than I'll work on a personal project. And I do that every week. And when he said to me that he's been doing this every week for 40 years, it became immediately clear to me why the man is so good.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
rinse and repeat.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? Actually, that reminds me, Kobe Bryant. I don't know, you've heard his story, but he was saying that every before every practice, like so, let's say they start practice at I don't know 8 o'clock every day, right? For when he was playing for whatever the team he was playing, he used to come 2 3 hours earlier just to have this extra time. And he was saying this that he's like, you know what? Maybe that's a little bit of extra time I'm putting in. But if you look for the kind of long term, 3 hours every single day for let's say next, I don't know, 5 years, whatever. Look how ahead you are, everybody, right? And and that also kind of like hit me hard that like I'm not saying we should put extra time, but having that time for personal growth is like so important, right? And then I think that motivates you big time because you're doing on something which really inspires you and make you feel better, and you learning, because that's another thing, because with the work we do, the technicalities is not a big of a deal anymore, right? Because we've got to the point where you do this automatically, you don't even have to think about it. But challenging yourself, that's what kind of motivates us, I think, a lot in the creative space, that you need to kind of this, I don't know how to say it, like this little drug which you kind of giving yourself, that you can push it more. And learning about this craft and expanding your knowledge, it's huge. And as you said, it just makes you better, right?
It gives you an opportunity to discover things.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter which way you approach it. It could be like, a personal project could be something you wake up one morning and you go like, oh, I've got this idea, I want to try that. Or you could see something and you go, I wonder how they did that. So you start experimenting. Either way, you'll learn and you'll get better. And you add, it's like a video game, you add ammunition and weaponry to your own arsenal.
Yeah.
And what happens is there's a number of things that happen. One is the next time you're in a situation where you need to figure something out, you may have already stumbled across the answer some other time when you were working on a shoot, um, you know, a personal project somewhere. But the other thing also is it allows you to shape your own perspective as a photographer,
Mhm.
and it allows you to create your own personality and your own individuality, over time because you're experimenting, you're trying out lots of different things. And always, again, I equate it to music. It's a really easy comparison to draw. When you grow up as a kid and you learn how to play the guitar,
Mhm.
you're influenced by other people's music. When I was a kid, I used to listen to Van Halen. I used to listen to ZZ Top. I'm a total ZZ Top fanatic. So
Mhm.
Billy Gibbons, huge thing for me.
Mhm.
Um, So there's a lot of Billy Gibbons in my life. There was a lot of Van Halen in my life. I used to love that. Steve Vai, Joe Satriani. The list is absolutely everything from, the rock players to, George Benson, John Abercrombie, the kind of jazz and fusion players, to blues players. I mean, the Three Kings. I mean, really, the list is endless. But every time I got into a particular artist, a particular guitar player, I would learn some of this stuff. And so it's like a big cauldron. Think of it as a big cauldron. Every time you learn something, you throw it in there. A little bit of Van Halen, a little bit of Steve Vai, a little bit of George Benson, a little bit of John Abercrombie, whatever. By the end of it, and you do that for years and years and years. By the end of it, that broth that you're cooking up becomes you. So that's your personality. That's who you are as a player. All of these influences are going to come out, and at some point, somebody say, "Hey, that sounds just like Kirsten's guitar parts."
Yeah.
You know,
That's
and
the biggest achievement we can have, right?
right. And so, and if you think about it, everybody's a little bit different. Everybody throws different ingredients into that cauldron over time, and that means that over time, everybody's going to be a little bit different. If you open your mind and you add you add lots of ingredients, you can create a recipe, or you can create a dish that's a lot more complex, that has a lot more shades in there, rather
Yeah.
than just pasta and, I don't know, ketchup.
Yeah. And I want to add one more little thing, if I may, for kind of metaphor for, what we talk about is also those, like, personal projects, the stuff what we try, kind of takes ingredients from all sorts of different kind of places, allows us also to make mistakes. Because I think that's one of the biggest thing with people don't talk about it, that everyone wants to do things perfectly or wants to kind of do it the best way possible. But in order, I think, to get there, like, you have to make a lot of mistakes, and you don't want to do this with clients. You have to do it in this kind of, like, I don't know, projects where you can do them right, and nobody's going to judge you, nobody's going to kind of like go after you, uh nobody going to crucify you for those mistakes. And mistakes are like a huge part of what we do. And again, like, as I said, like, everyone is pushing for this perfect shot, perfect image, everything has to be good, but nobody talks, like, how many images we have to screw up by the time we get to the one with, like, okay, what, that's finally looks good. But we don't see that path, right? We just see the final shot sometimes from some best photographers. But I'm guessing even with Joel Grimm's, like, how many images or how many screw ups he had by the time he get, like, okay, now this is working, right?
Absolutely. And add something to that. um Usually people say, you have to make all of your mistakes when you're not working with the client. And on the surface, that's absolutely right? Because
Mhm.
when you're working with a client, of course, you want things to be perfect, because the assumption is that if I do a perfect job, they'll hire me again, or they'll recommend me, or
Yes.
whatever. But I'd like to put in there that sometimes it's actually really beneficial to make mistakes when you're with a client, because the question is not whether you make a mistake or not. The question is how you handle that with the
Yes.
client. This is a really important lesson to learn when you're dealing with, with other people. You know, um, Everybody, no matter what, no matter whether you're a wedding photographer or portrait
Mhm.
photographer, headshot photographer, whatever it is, everybody's screwed up on a job. You
Yeah.
know, at
Oh,
some
big time.
point, at some point, the thing is not. The problem is not making mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. It's a human condition. We're not perfect.
Mhm.
The question is, how do you deal with it?
Yeah.
How do you talk to the client? What do you do to rectify that mistake? You know,
Yeah.
so, I mean, obviously, some mistakes are worse than others. I mean, as a wedding photographer, this is I always say this. My ultimate nightmare would be photographing a wedding on film,
Oh, yeah.
because it's this thing. It's like
Well, I could tell you a little story where my two cameras broke on the wedding, on the one, like, within 30 minutes,
right.
and I was in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, and as you said, like, how you handle this, right? How you deal with the situation. Yeah, I 100%. But I agree with you 100%. How you, because I think also that those situations teach you sometimes more, because if someone tells you like, hey, you know what, you have to have a backup camera, whatever, right? Like we have all this stuff, but those real challenges where you just like in the kind of, how would I say, deep shit, and you just like, okay, you know what, how I can kind of resolve this quickly, efficiently, and make it work, and how to deal with clients, so
Yeah.
they kind of can understand your side of the story as well.
And often, no matter how well prepared you think you are, and no matter how well thought through your whole process is, there are always these little things that just happen, and these are the things that go wrong. And in the end, you go, I could have never, I would have
Yeah.
never thought that this could actually become a problem. I remember, one time I shot a boxing event, and the way these boxing events work is, imagine you have sometimes multiple rings,
Hmm.
and at those events, there's maybe sometimes 20 to 30 fights happening in this one event.
Hmm.
There's 3 rounds per fight, everything's super quick. When I'm shooting these events, what happens is when I'm shooting the fights, the images are getting printed out at a printing station somewhere else in the venue. And so my images need to immediately make their way from ringside to the printing station so they can start printing them out and putting them into frames and whatnot. So what that means is, in practical terms, after each fight, 3 rounds, I take out an SD card out of my card, I put it into a laptop, which is connected to the printing station, and it will basically pipe the images over. Whilst that's happening, I'm popping another SD card into my camera, in order to shoot the next fight. So whilst these images are uploading, I'm already shooting the next fight, and then the same spiel starts over again. And
Hmm.
so I'm just switching over these SD cards. So that's all cool. And you think like, I've got a spare SD card in case something goes wrong, blah blah blah.
Hmm.
What you can't account for is your own stupidity, or like my stupidity in this case. Because one time I was like, it's dark usually, and you're really under pressure. You don't have a lot of time because you got to run from your side of the ring to the laptop whilst they're already getting the next fighters in. There's really not a lot of time at all. So you're rushing. And of course, when you're rushing, you lose concentration. And so I put the SD card into my camera the wrong way around. And in the stress and the panic, I pushed the SD card, and what I did was I actually completely destroyed the SD card slot in my camera. And when I realized that, I'm like, I've just busted my camera and the SD card, you know? And of course, I had a second camera on that gig, but this wouldn't have been a thing that I would have foreseen, that I could
Yeah.
idiotically put the SD card the wrong way. Like things like that. These things happen.
Yeah.
It's called, I think in the UK, they call it Sod's Law. If something can
Mhm.
go wrong, it will.
Oh, yeah. And that's also another thing that they usually happens in the moments where you least expect it, right? Like that's what I've learned.
Yeah.
Um, and even you can be fully prepared, have backups and all this stuff. Like, I had this wedding one day where my camera, well, dropped. Like, I just kind of like slipped from my hand, and like I just busted entire lens. And what was interesting, the next day I had another wedding, right? It was like no time to get like new lens or something. And like what's interesting, I remember I got home like literally crying, just like, okay, like how I'm gonna like deal with this, right? You try to figure it out. But luckily, only what happened, because I thought the entire like the front glass kind of cracked, but I had a filter on it, so just the filter cracked, and the lens still kind of was busted, but still somehow work. And I'm like, yeah, it's just kind of interesting how like things can quickly go wrong, and then you
Very
have
quickly.
like,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
that
yeah,
is the thing.
yeah, yeah.
So always carry a backup is the moral of the story there.
The moral, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's switch the gears,
Sure.
and let's talk about a topic which we touch a lot on our last podcast when I was invited to you podcast, and let's talk a little bit about AI. I know this topic brings a lot of heat, but I want to kind of talk about it because I think the best way to find some kind of like, I don't know, understanding and the path, and like how we can approach this whole thing, to discussing this with all sorts of different people, and then kind of hear their opinion. So as you probably know, this whole industry is going through massive disruption right now. Everyone is losing their mind. What this technology brings you to the table.
Yeah.
What is fascinating for me is the fact that there's two oppositions. People who are so for it and they open to try it. I don't know, discover it, explore it. Try to kind of see what this technology allows us to do. And there is other side of interesting people who are completely against it. um, and they I'm not saying they try to kind of like shut this down, but they really look at this whole thing as a kind of something very negative, something what's going to bring a lot of, I even heard the word evil into this industry. So what is your take on it, like how you look at it? Are you more optimistic, or you kind of like, I'm not saying scared, but what I'm trying to say, like how you just like looking at this whole new technology with just like it's already here, we see it's creating some amazing results. It's impacting photography on so many different levels. And yeah, like what is your take on this whole topic?
What's interesting, because only a few days ago, I did a talk called "Photography is Dead,"
Okay.
um, and it's a little bit of a shock effect. But the one of the things I did in that talk was I went back through history and
Mhm.
examined all the times when photography was said to be dead.
Mhm.
It goes back to when photography was first invented. Painters, you say, well, this is it, art is dead. You need no
Yeah.
skill anymore. Somebody just presses a button and there's, you don't need to
And
be able
yeah.
to paint anymore. You know, when Kodak brought out the box camera, you know, all of a sudden photography was dead, yet again, because now you can have this little handheld device and everybody can now take a picture. That's incredible. You know, um, when Polaroid brought the first instant, camera out in 1948, right?
Wow.
Although this didn't become super popular until the 70s, but actually Polaroid brought it out in 1948. Um, Again, photography was dead because now you don't need to develop anything, but you just press a button and the
Mhm.
photo's right there. You don't, that's the death of photography labs and whatever. Then digital became a thing, and again, photography was dead. Um, I mean, now it's AI. The reality, though, is there's never been a time in history when we took more images than we were taking. Now, here's a little test case. Give me a guess. What's your guess in 2024? In that 1 year, how
Mhm.
many images do you think were taken on Earth just in 2024 alone?
Well, I could say in trillions or more. Like I don't think there's even number.
Yeah,
I think even I've read some statistic how many images are uploaded to Instagram, like per second or per, like it was just insane numbers.
yeah. So it's about 2 trillion images were
Mhm.
taken in 2024.
Yeah.
That's 5.6 billion images a day. Or just think of the scale of
Just
that.
yeah,
It's unbelievable.
signal per second. Yeah.
Yeah, we've never taken more images than ever before. So photography is not dead. Photography is actually alive and thriving. There's absolutely no way we're going to stop taking images tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
The mode in which we've taken those images, so you know the gear has changed. It's changed from big, plate cameras to the 8x10s to medium format film to 35 millimeter film to digital to instant Polaroids to whatever to smartphones. Because when smartphones came around, again photography was dead. Is another instance when photography
Yeah.
was dead. Now it's AI. The reality is, the maybe maybe in 10 years time, maybe in 20 years time, in 50 years time, maybe cameras the way that we know them now won't exist anymore, because let's face it, we don't take pictures on plate cameras anymore. We don't do that.
Mhm.
We don't use those anymore. So those people back in the day who said, well, plate cameras are dead, they were right. Plate cameras are dead, unless you're a hobbyist and you like doing that, right? Um, you know, hardly anybody shoots on 35 millimeter film anymore, although, there's a resurgence of film.
And you could also say, for if you're a real photographer, that's how you shoot.
You can say that, but the thing is,
Yeah.
it's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Being a real photographer, I don't know. Clients' expectations is really all that matters. I had a really interesting conversation with Lisa Carney only very recently, which is an episode that by the time this comes out, it probably hasn't come out yet. But I had a conversation about how AI is actually shaping the way that we see images now, and what impact that has on retouching and the way that we take pictures. I think we're at a time where even if you're if you're taking in inverted commas real images, real photos, the look and the feel of those is now starting to be influenced by that AI look.
Yeah.
And it's because it's like anything, people see that kind of look and that's what they want. And that's cool. But all of these things come and go, just like flared jeans,
Mm.
bell-bottom jeans, one time they're in fashion, then they're out of fashion. So I'm convinced that what we're experiencing now is just one of those steps. It's
Mhm.
one of those instances where we think, oh my God, photography is not going to continue the way that we're used to. And we're absolutely right. It won't continue the way that we're used to. Um, is it necessarily going to be worse? No, not really, because anybody who's used to digital camera nowadays will attest to the fact that actually it's a lot easier, and there are lots of advantages compared to using um, an SLR camera in 1985.
Mhm.
There are many, many advantages. And the reality is, film is actually still around. If that's what floats your boat, you can still do that. Totally
Yeah.
cool. Are you going to be able to satisfy your client's expectations, though? And the answer is no. So it really boils down to clients' expectations. If we're talking about photography in a commercial sense, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So for instance, it's interesting because photography runs deep in my family. It started in 1938, and I remember stories from the early, like the 70s and the early 80s. As far as like photographing weddings was concerned, what happened back then was you would deliver an album with 25 images in it.
Yeah.
That'd be a delivery. I remember people that my dad used to hang out with, these wedding photographers. They used to shoot 3 weddings a day, one in the morning, one midday, and one in the evening. And they would deliver like an album of 25 shots each time.
Mm.
Now as a wedding photographer, well, you might shoot one
Thousands.
wedding. Yeah, well, you shoot one wedding a week, but you deliver thousands of images. And the
Yeah.
only reason you can do that is because of the technology that we have today. But if you get an inquiry, and many of my wedding photographer friends can attest to that, the expectation from the client is hundreds, if not thousands, of images. So if
Yeah.
you said to your client, well, I'm going to deliver 25 images, they would go, well, I'm not going to pay you $3,000 for that.
Yeah. You know what? I remember when I got into wedding photography, and I think that's amazing example how technology also shift wedding industry to completely
Yeah.
different path. Because I remember I actually got into wedding photography where it was this like massive shift and massive transition from film to digital, and all those film photographers start literally dying off because nobody wants to work with them because you have to come to the studio. They have this I don't know, specific poses, some weird props, and you got this 10 images from your wedding, right? And someone like me who bought this brand new digital camera, and I was saying to the client, hey, I can shoot 4,000 images on your wedding. Like, it was just a selling point. Like, that's how I really turned my business really quickly overnight into something very successful, because the number of images and the way we approach weddings, right, was from, as you said, 25 pictures to 4,000 images, and they got images from literally every moment of their wedding day, right?
Yeah.
So that's excellent point. How technology completely can shift, and I think one thing what I want to add is, because I think people quite often confuse photography with creating images, right? Because as you said, like we will be continuing creating images. It's just the tools which are changing, right?
It's the tools that are changing. There's certain needs are going to be the same. Like take weddings as an example. there's still going to be a need to photograph events like weddings, because these are they're very personal. I don't really think that, you know, despite the occurrence of AI, a lot is going to change in terms of client expectations when it comes to their
Mhm.
wedding. You know, do I want an AI generated image of myself and my wife? From No, I don't. I want to actually see us. That's the whole point. You know.
But
Um,
you know what? Again, you never know.
well, you
That's the
never
thing.
know. That is very true. But
And what I'm trying to also say, and I'm gonna kind of like, I don't know, put some kind of pin on it a little bit.
sure,
Um, I also think that that the AI technology is also progressing. It's getting better, right? And I'm not saying we go to some kind of deep fake, stuff which looks AI artificially, and then like you can see, okay, this is AI created. But I deeply believe that at some point, we might have, let's say, wedding photographer for our wedding day. But if we wanted, let's say, some, I don't know, extremely unique and amazing portrait of us with AI, of kind of like, if we could kind of like add something to it with AI help to make this image like extremely, I don't know, uniquely beautiful, I think people would go for it. I don't see why they would kind of hesitate, especially if would look really realistic, would like be kind of piece of art. Why not, right? Like even right now with headshots, I'm adding digital backdrops for, so this is also like a little AI ingredient to kind of add something to the image. We're not changing the structure of the person, it's just adding some kind of element which kind of enhance the image, right? And I think that's going to happen with the wedding. And I think AI is not there yet, but I deeply believe that within the next 6 months to couple years, we will be able to manipulate those images that nobody gonna see the difference.
true.
Um, yeah.
Here's the thing. So there's something called I think it's called the cobbler analogy.
Okay.
Um, if you imagine a number of centuries ago, before the Industrial Revolution and so on, the only way that you could get shoes is to have them made by a
Hmm.
cobbler, right? And this would be a standard thing. So, you know, they wouldn't be terribly expensive because everybody would have to have their shoes made that way. You know, the demand was such that, you know, there were many cobblers around, and, you know, and they would churn out tons of shoes so that everybody could wear shoes.
Hmm.
You know, then came the Industrial Revolution, you know, changed all that because now you can make, you know, shoes in factories. And then, you know, then came this whole thing where we now outsource all of that to countries where, you know, labor costs are dirt cheap. And, you know, all of a sudden, the vast majority of shoes that we buy in the Western world are now made in the Far East. Okay. Because production costs are so much cheaper there. And that's how, you know, we can go into Walmart, you know, or Target, or, you know, Tesco's over here in the UK, whatever, you
Hmm.
know, insert your own supermarket type of thing. And
Yeah.
you can buy like super cheap trainers, right? Or
Hmm.
sneakers, for next to nothing really by comparison. You know, would have never been possible. But we also have certain expectations. You know, these are cheap sneakers. You know, I can wear them. I can run through the mud with them. I use them to take the dog out. Doesn't really matter. You know,
Hmm.
it's, you're part of the throwaway society. Like if I ruin them, I can get rid of them, buy some new ones, no problem.
Hmm.
That's very different from getting shoes handmade by a cobbler in Siena, Italy. You know, where each pair of shoes sets you back a grand or so, or maybe more, right?
Hmm.
But this is a different thing, and you would buy that for different reasons. These would not be shoes that you would throw away that easily. These would not be shoes you'd be wearing, you know, for your dog walk.
Yep.
This would be a very special purchase, and you would buy that for a very special reason. You know, maybe you're somebody who likes the finer things in life. You know, maybe these are shoes for a very special occasion where you think, you know, I really, you know, want to spend some money on handmade shoes. You know, these are different products. The people that buy handmade Italian shoes from a small cobbler somewhere in Siena, Italy, those clients are very different people from those who buy their shoes at Walmart.
Yeah.
And what that means for our industry is, if you're shooting headshots, for example, you may have to either change the way you do things, do something different, or change your clientele and look for a different group of customers. Because the one thing is still clear, there's always going to be people who enjoy the handmade shoes, the more boutique and more exclusive things. And if in a world where everybody takes selfies with their smartphone and turns them into, uses some AI app to, to
Yep.
turn them into professional headshots, then these people are not your clients. So
Yep.
you're gonna have to look for who your clients are, and also, you may have to think about, well, what problem can I? Because ultimately, this is what it boils down to. It boils down to what problem can I solve as a professional. Another really very quickly really good example would be, volume headshots for companies. The thing about that is, you could say, let's say there's a company and they say like, oh, we've got 100 employees, we need headshots for the website, da da da, and so boss man says to middle manager, find us a headshot photographer. So middle manager could now go, well, I'll just download this app for $1.40, and then I will turn everybody's snapshot into professional looking headshots.
Yeah.
This would be a cheap way of doing it, but it would cost a ton of time. First of all, you're going to have to get 100 snapshots out of all of these employees, and you know what it's like when you send an email around. 10% are going to respond, and the other ones are going to say, "Well, I'll do it tomorrow or never." And and it's just it's a pain in the backside. So it becomes a problem that's actually going to be quite time intensive. So at that point, it's easier to basically say, you know what? I'm just going to phone a professional, let them do the job, and all I'm interested in is the result. When I was shooting conferences, the exact same thing happened. They would my clients would fly me out of London to all sorts of places around the
Mm.
globe. You know, and I would, in the beginning, I would sit there. I remember, like, for the first few years, I would sit and think, like, why do they do this? This is really expensive. I mean, they have to buy plane tickets for me. They have to put me up in a hotel. They have to pay my salary, blah, 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 my fees. This is really expensive. I'm sure if you're setting up a conference in Budapest, Hungary, there are many, many, many photographers there that are going to be a massively cheaper than I am. Why do that? Why spend that amount of money on me and flying me around there when they could save so much money hiring somebody around there? And I remember hanging out with one of the people on the management team that organized a conference like
Mhm.
this, and we had a conversation over a couple of beers, or maybe more than a couple of beers,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
And I asked him that, like, why do you? I don't really understand why you do that. And he goes, "Well, it's really simple. We have a problem. We need that problem solved. You're the guy who can solve that problem. If I email you or call you and I say, can you be in Budapest on the 18th of the month for 3 days and do X, Y, and Z, and you say yes to me, you've just solved my problem. I can move on to the next thing. I don't
Yeah.
have to worry about that anymore." That's the thing. So I think, you know, if we start thinking of ourselves as problem solvers
Mhm.
rather than photographers or artists, even worse, artists, right? Um, then we will be able to fit in to this new world of artificial intelligence and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. I think that's really the key. It's always been true. Every time photography was pronounced dead, every time the technology changed, the medium changed, whatever,
Came out
um,
even stronger,
it came out of it stronger, but different.
different. Yeah.
That's the thing. So maybe tomorrow, I don't know, maybe tomorrow all the churches in the world decide that weddings are not a thing anymore.
Mm.
you know, then
Yeah.
as a wedding photographer, you're kind of out of business because they don't, just like a conference photographer, when there's a global pandemic that comes along that nobody
Yeah.
could foresee, out of nowhere, from one day to the next, you're out of a job because, you know, and the lesson I learned in that instance was a really important lesson, because I learned that I had made the cardinal mistake in running my business. I set everything onto one pillar. There was only one pillar to my business. And that was conferences. The minute you took that away, the entire business crumbled, because there weren't any other pillars to hold that business up.
Yeah.
It wasn't like I diversified. It wasn't like I had, oh, well, I also shot weddings, or I also worked with lots of small businesses, like local
Mm.
businesses, for example. And so it wasn't a thing where, okay, well, the conferences are going to fall away, and that's going to hit me to some degree. But actually, I have these other things that I'm doing, that can provide a fallback. That wasn't there.
Yeah.
And so as a consequence of that, I figured that I needed to structure my business differently, and I need to do
Mhm.
different things. And to be honest, the podcast doesn't really come into that at all, because I didn't think of it as a business at all,
Mhm.
especially not at the time. Um, but it's changed completely how I approach, photography business,
Yeah.
and it forced me to make changes, which sometimes a good thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. From one hand, I think we should look from like broader perspective, and this was my approach to podcast. That maybe I'm putting time into it. It's you cannot monetize as much. Per se, just focusing strictly on creating those podcasts, putting them out, whatever. Sometimes people getting some I don't know, sponsorships, whatever, but that's rare, especially in our industry. But I think the education I got from it completely changed my business. And I think you cannot really put price on it, right? Because you have one podcast with some interesting person who really shift the way you think. You implement some of those informations on that knowledge into your business, and all of a sudden things starts working. um yeah, I deeply believe that, and I agree with you 100% when it comes to having one pillar. I was in the same kind of spot at some point, where you're just focusing on one thing, and you just like if let's say pandemic was the best example, that for so many people just business
Yeah.
stopped overnight. And if you don't have all sorts of different avenues of income, or you're not doing some other stuff which can bring you revenue, like you really cooked. And I think that was one of the biggest lessons from pandemic, that you have to versatile what you do, and we can do a lot of different things, there's no question about it, right? um but the one thing what I also want to say, to add to your point, that sometimes we have to do some additional stuff, and even they seems like there's no kind of like money from it, but there are some things which we can pull out of that, which really can kind of change the way we think, the way we kind of look at business, and how we can educate ourselves. There's no question about it. And I
And
that's
yeah,
yeah,
and,
go
and you
for it.
build and you build networks. This is I
Yes.
think one of the biggest advantages of doing something like the Camera Shake podcast, for example, is I've gotten to know so many people. So whenever I come up against a problem now,
Yeah.
I most likely have somebody I can text or call or email or something, say, hey, can you help me figure this out, or what would you do, or do you have any ideas? Da, 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 da. You know, it's become such a useful tool in so many different ways. Um, and that's one of the biggest things, because as you say, anybody anybody who thinks about getting into podcasting to make money or to get rich, it's not a get rich quick scheme.
Yeah. No, no, no,
That's
not at all. Not
definitely
at all.
true.
But there's one, like, I want to share one story quickly. I'm not going to mention any names, but when I started my wedding photography, I approached some photographer, like really well-known name, with some questions. And the response I got was, okay, you know what? I can talk to you. I can give you the advice. But I think he mentioned like $700 for an hour consultation. And I'm
Right.
like, I cannot afford this. Like, why can I, like, I'm starting the business, like I'm just scrambling for every penny to make it work. And now I have to pay like $700 for like 1 hour consultation. And, I just like, what, sorry, I just can't afford it. And basically he ignored me. And I'm not going to lie to you, 5 years down the road, I asked him to join my podcast. He did. And basically spill everything, all my questions,
Well, there you go.
what I had,
That's it.
so I'm not. again, like I know I don't want people to kind of use it as a kind of trick people into kind of getting some kind of information, but I
No.
found on podcasts people are extremely open, right? And they share that information, they share their knowledge, whatever questions you have, they always kind of are willing to answer. But as you said, I agree with you, like you creating this community of people, and they becoming your friends, right? If you really think
Yeah.
about it, after every podcast, these people becoming your friends. And if you have any problem, you can always reach out to them, and they always kind of help you, talk to you. It's kind of fascinating how you can kind of like build on that, and how kind of amazing community you can create around you to make your business thrive, for sure.
That's a great thing about podcasting just generally, and actually sort of coming back to your question at the very beginning, it's like, why did I ask you originally to come on my show? When I remember years ago when I was starting out in headshot photography, what your podcast was, one of the podcasts I used to listen to. And the thing I really loved about it was that you talked about like everyday problems that headshot photographers have,
Mhm.
um, and I really liked that format because, I'd listen to it and go like, oh yeah, that happened to me. Or I would see a title and go, oh yeah, actually that's a problem I came across. So
Mhm.
let's see what Rafael has to say about that. And this is a thing, it's a really great way of learning, because this is, in a sense, we live in the age of information sharing. You know,
Yes.
um, sometimes it's difficult to navigate because there's such a tsunami of information that we're exposed to, whether it's on
Mhm.
YouTube or wherever, and it's difficult to see a clear path through that. This really is the advantage, of educational institutions like university, for example, where you have a learning path. Like my
Mm.
background is actually in education. I used to teach in schools a lot. I used to teach a lot of guitar in classrooms and things. Um, and the one thing you realize very quickly is that you need to create a learning path so that just like a Lego house,
Yeah.
each bit of information or each bit of knowledge, um, slots into another thing so that you can build a house of Lego. If too many bricks are missing, the whole thing's going to be unstable and
Mm.
eventually fall down. And learning is exactly the same thing. A clear learning path will get you there quicker because in the beginning, when you first get into something, you simply don't know what you don't know, and that's a problem.
That's a
Because then you
problem.
don't, you go to YouTube, you look at portrait retouching. All right, there's a gazillion videos that come up, and then you go like, well, what should I start with? Should I start with skin or eyes or hair?
Mhm.
Or, you know, and then you go, okay, well, I'm going to start with skin. Boom. Now you search for skin retouching, and there's a gazillion videos. And some of them tell you the exact opposite of another
Mm.
thing. And it's completely confusing. You have no structure and no thread, no path that takes you through all of that.
Mm.
Which is why I like structured learning paths a lot. Like Flown, for instance, do a thing. I think it's called Flown Pro,
Mhm.
um, where you know there are a gazillion of Flown videos out there on YouTube. But what they've done is they've taken some content and they turned it into a structured learning path. And now, if you do the course on portrait retouching, it takes you through it in a really structured approach. So
Yeah.
now it's maybe 10 videos that you watch. By the end of it, you really know a thing or two about retouching a
It's like
portrait.
it's like
Creative,
hunting for knowledge. Yeah.
yeah, creative life used to be one of these things.
Yeah.
The same thing. The amount of classes I bought on creative life in the day. Actually, it's a funny thing. So I learned how to use frequency separation for all of us
Mhm.
portrait photographers. We know what
Yeah.
that is. I learned that by watching a course that I bought that Lisa Carney taught on creative life. And I
Mm.
remember I had to watch that thing 3 times over because it was so over my head in the beginning. I was like,
Yeah.
"No," I just like she starts talking about,
And it
next
looked
level.
easy when they were doing, right? And they get this amazing results. And it's just like, how the hell that happened? And I'm trying
Yeah.
to do this on my images, and it's just like it's so different and it looks
Yeah.
so bad. Yeah. I
And
remember those
you get one thing wrong in the initial setup and then nothing works. Your gradient looks like you're burning. And it's just, so it's funny because back in the day, I thought, oh, this is a fantastic course. And Lisa had done a number of other additional courses that I found really, really useful. And now I've had Lisa on the show several times. We've talked, quite a lot. and she's definitely somebody I would call a friend,
Mhm.
which to me is bizarre because I started from a point of like, this is somebody who's like so far ahead, completely, not approachable. Turns out I was completely wrong. And these are the things. So when you do something like that, when you do something like, like a podcast or a YouTube channel or something, you create this network of people around you that you can access, and it's all about sharing. If anybody gets in touch with me and has a question about just about anything, I'm happy to,
Yeah,
I'm happy
absolutely.
to help. And so that's ultimately why I'm doing my podcast. This is why you're doing your podcast. This is why a lot of people do what they do in this field, is because actually ultimately it's about sharing of information. It's about
Absolutely.
putting that stuff out there so that other people can benefit from it. you know
Yeah. For sure. And I think also, the podcast form allows you to dive deep into someone's, life and career. And, especially when it comes to photography, they can really open up and give much more valuable informations. And having those long kind of conversations really can open up so many different doors. And that's why I really like podcasts, and not just photography ones, but in general, like listening to people where they can really slowly and step by step explaining, some of those things. It makes huge difference, right? And I think we just right now in this kind of world where we are between those two kind of worlds. One, kind of the short content, 30-second a minute, they get like this spill up some quick information, or there's like very long term where you have 2-3 hours podcast where people dive really deep into some topics. Yeah, I think both are they're good, but I really like the podcast form because you can really get really deep into some of those informations, that knowledge, and then it really kind of can absorb this better. And it's interesting, sometimes you go back to some of those podcasts and you always kind of hear something different or something new. You just kind of you need to digest them on its own, which is kind of also fascinating.
It's also a great way to discover things. Like I like to listen to a lot of history podcasts,
Yeah.
and there's so many weird subjects that I never really thought about. And I just come across, the I don't know, some history of something in the 14th century. You go, oh, that sounds pretty interesting. I never even knew that existed.
Yeah.
It's a really whether it's and the thing, just like you, I love podcasts. I love the podcast format. I like the fact that I can listen to it no matter whether I listen to it when I go to bed, when I take the dog out, when I'm in the car, in particular, or
Mm.
when I'm editing or something like that. And you know, there's always the different types of podcasts for different scenarios and different needs. Sometimes I want to learn something. You know, sometimes I like to listen to very technical podcasts about marketing. Let's say,
Yeah.
right? Um, sometimes I want to learn something about history because it's just an interesting subject. And sometimes I just want to listen to something that's just purely entertaining,
Mhm.
true crime or something or whatever,
Yeah.
um, where you just go, this is a cool story, Um, and but the format is, as you say, it's just a really good format that's so accessible no matter what you do, because what am I going to do when I sit on a plane for hours on end? Can't go anywhere, especially on like inter-European planes, but there isn't really a screen, so you can't really
Yeah.
watch
Yeah.
any movies. So you either have to bring your
Just sit
iPad
there.
or whatever. You just
Yeah.
sit there.
Yeah.
Um, and so listening to podcasts is just the perfect thing for me, which is ultimately why I'm making a podcast, because I actually like the format a lot.
Absolutely. Okay, so the plan was we're going to be talking for an hour, and we
I don't even
are
know.
a little bit over time.
Right.
But what I would like to do, I would like to invite you again, and I hope we can do it soon. That was extremely meaningful and deep conversation. I think we could talk for about another, I don't know, countless hours.
Easily.
It seems like we are both extremely passionate about what we do, and just the fact we are both in this, kind of podcast industry, if we can call that. Yeah, we are extremely kind of open to this long conversation. But
Yeah.
let's kind of stop here. Let's kind of make this part one, and we very soon jump into part too. And yeah, I would love to have you again. I was again amazing conversation. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge, all your experiences, also kind of showing how you got into the podcasts, and then how much they are changing our world. And I also hope that those podcasts helping not only us but also helping all people who are listening to it. I know this is kind of niche of listeners, but I know they're there and they're listening, and I am always getting some good feedback. And it's extremely rewarding when you can hear like, hey, I listened to your podcast, and I've learned so much, and then there was great conversation. It's truly what kind of pushes me to kind of invite more people and talk to them.
Absolutely, Rafael. It was an absolute pleasure being on the show. Thank you so much. It's this, that's what happens when you put two podcasters together,
Yeah,
whose job it is to talk.
exactly,
That is
exactly.
automatically going to be a longer
That's
conversation.
what's going to happen. Absolutely. Okay. So thank you so much. I will link all your information so people can dive into your podcast. Like I know everyone knows you anyways, but we'll kind of link all of it. I have to say that you have some of the most amazing photographers on your show. So whoever is watching this and got to this point, I highly recommend to listen to Kersten podcast, because there is not only so much educational things, but valuable and interesting stories, and all sorts of those photographers. They have, as you said, some of those most amazing stories would happen during their photography journey. So they're very worth to listen.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rafael, for having me on the show. I really
Okay.
appreciate it.
Thank you.